Welcome to Sleepytime Stories, where we listen, we relax, and drift into a world of dreams. My name is John Bush. Tonight, I have a special story just for you. The Candle of Eternal Love, a special candle, when lit, shows a person the face of their true love in the flickering flames. So, get cozy, close your eyes, and let your imagination take flight. It was the kind of night that made a man feel small. Cold wind howled through the empty streets, rattling loose street signs and sweeping dead leaves into forgotten corners. The city, usually pulsing with life, had grown quiet under the weight of the coming winter. James pulled his coat tighter around his body, his breath curling in the air like smoke. He wasn't sure why he was out this late, wandering with no direction, no purpose. Maybe it was the loneliness creeping in, the kind that settled deep in his bones and refused to let go. Love had never been kind to him. Every time he had reached for it, it had slipped through his fingers like sand. That's when he saw it. A small bookstore, tucked between two towering buildings, its wooden sign swaying slightly in the wind. The place hadn't been there before, or at least, he had never noticed it. The glass windows were clouded with dust, but a soft glow flickered from within, warm and inviting. Something about it called to him, like an echo from a dream he couldn't remember. He hesitated only for a moment before pushing open the door. Inside, the air smelled of aged paper, candle wax, and something else, something older, richer, like time itself had settled into the walls. The place was packed with towering bookshelves, each one overflowing with stories waiting to be told. Shadows danced in the dim light, cast by the many candles flickering atop wooden counters. Behind one of those counters stood an old woman. She was small and frail, wrapped in layers of dark fabric that made her look like a ghost from another time. Her silver hair was pulled into a long braid, her face lined with the weight of many years. But it was her eyes that held him still, deep and knowing, as if they had seen everything and forgotten nothing. "You came," she said, as if she had been expecting him. James frowned. "Do we know each other?" A slow smile curled her lips. "Not yet." He should have left. Should have turned around and walked back into the cold night, back to the safety of things that made sense. But something rooted him to the spot. Something in the way she watched him, as if she could see straight into his soul. "You're looking for something," she continued, moving slowly around the counter. "Something you've lost. Or maybe something you've never found." James swallowed. "I don't even know what I'm looking for." She nodded, as if she already knew his answer. Then, from beneath the counter, she pulled out a small wooden box. It was old, its surface smooth with age, the carvings along its edges intricate and strange. She placed it in front of him, resting her fingers gently atop the lid. "This," she said softly, "is what you need." He stared at the box. "What is it?" "A candle. But not just any candle." Her voice dropped lower, a whisper wrapped in mystery. "This one is special. When lit, it reveals the face of your true love in the flames." James let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. That's ridiculous. Is it? She lifted her gaze, those ancient eyes locking onto his. Or is it exactly what you've been searching for? He opened his mouth to argue, to tell her that love didn't work that way, that no candle could fix what was broken inside of him. But the words never came. Because suddenly, he felt it. A pull. A deep, undeniable pull toward the box. His fingers twitched at his sides, aching to touch it, to open it, to see if there was truth behind her words. "What's the catch?" he asked. The old woman tilted her head. "Love is eternal. The truth, however, is not always easy to bear." Something in the way she said it sent a shiver down his spine. But still, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet. "How much?" The old woman smiled again. "It is not bought with money, James." His breath caught in his throat. "I never told you my name," he whispered. She didn't answer. Instead, she slid the box closer to him. "Take it," she said. "Light it when you are ready. But remember this, love, once seen, cannot be unseen." James hesitated. Then, slowly, he reached out and took the box in his hands. It was warm. Warmer than it should have been. As he turned to leave, the old woman spoke one last time. "Be careful what you seek," she murmured. "Not all love stories have happy endings." The words followed him out the door, into the cold night. But the bookstore, when he turned back, was gone. Sometimes, the most unexpected stories find us when we least expect them. If you want to hear more stories like this, mysteries wrapped in love, fate, and the unknown, don't forget to like and subscribe. Because the best stories, they're the ones waiting in the dark. As James walked home, the box pressed tightly against his chest, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. And fear. Because if what the woman said was true, if the candle really showed him his true love, then he had one terrifying question left to answer. Did he truly want to see the face of the one he was destined to love? Or was it better never to know? James sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the wooden box resting on his kitchen table like a secret waiting to be told. The city outside was alive with distant sirens and the occasional honk of a car, but inside, there was only silence. The weight of the candle inside the box felt heavier than it should have been. The old woman's words echoed in his mind. Love, once seen, cannot be unseen. His fingers hovered over the lid. Was this real? Or had the loneliness twisted his mind enough to make him believe in fairy tales? He had spent years convincing himself that love wasn't for him. That it was something other people found, people luckier, better, more whole than he was. But what if, just what if, this candle could show him something different? With a deep breath, he flipped the latch and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was a single candle. It wasn't large, nor was it particularly beautiful. No engravings, no markings. Just a simple, pale wax candle with a wick waiting to be lit. Beside it lay a single match. James picked up the matchstick, rolling it between his fingers. His pulse quickened. This was ridiculous. Absurd. He should throw it away, forget about the old bookstore and the strange woman. But his hand moved on its own. He struck the match. A small, golden flame flickered to life, dancing in the darkness. Slowly, he brought it to the candle's wick, watching as the fire caught hold. And then, the room changed. The shadows on the walls began to shift, twisting and curling like living things. The flame grew taller, brighter, casting strange, golden light across the table. The air became thick, humming with an unseen energy. James's breath hitched. Because in the flickering light, a face began to appear. She was beautiful. Not in the way models were. Not in the way Hollywood sold beauty. She had soft features, warm eyes, lips that looked like they had whispered secrets to the moon. Her hair moved as if caught in a gentle breeze, even though the air in his apartment was still. The flames wrapped around her form, revealing glimpses of a smile, a gaze full of something deep, something that made James's chest tighten. He leaned forward, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. "Who are you?" he whispered. The woman in the flame tilted her head, as if she could hear him. And then, she whispered back. But her voice was not soft. It was broken. Hollow. A sound of something lost. "James, why did you leave me?" A shock of ice shot through his veins. His chair scraped against the floor as he stumbled backward, heart hammering. "No," he breathed. "That's not possible." The woman's eyes darkened. The candle flickered violently, the light twisting, warping. Then the flame turned black. The entire room plunged into darkness. James gasped, hands fumbling for the candle, the match, anything to stop whatever was happening. But the moment his fingers touched the wax, a pulse of energy shot through his body, knocking the breath from his lungs. And then he was falling. James's eyes snapped open. He was no longer in his apartment. The world around him was wrong. The sky was deep gray, swirling with thick clouds that stretched endlessly above him. The ground beneath his feet was soft, shifting like sand, but cold as ice. In the distance, shadows moved, shapes without form, whispering things he couldn't understand. And in front of him, she stood there, the woman from the flame. But she was not whole. Her body flickered like static, her edges blurred and shifting. Her eyes, which had once been warm, were now filled with something else. Something darker. "James," she whispered again, stepping toward him. He staggered back. "Who are you?" The woman reached for him, but her fingers dissolved into smoke before they could touch his skin. Her face twisted, pain flashing across it. "You forgot me," she whispered. "But I never forgot you." James's breathing was ragged. "I don't understand. I don't even know you." The woman's gaze sharpened. And then, the shadows around them began to move, shifting closer. You will, she said. Soon. The wind picked up, howling like a wounded animal. The world shook. The shadows surged forward, swallowing everything in darkness. And James woke up. He was back in his apartment. The candle was still burning. The flame was normal again, small and golden, flickering gently as if nothing had happened. But James knew better. He could still feel it. The cold. The voice. The darkness pressing in around him. And worst of all, the memory of her. Because deep down, in some buried part of his soul, James knew she had not been a stranger. And he knew this was only the beginning. James sat in his apartment, his hands trembling as he stared at the flickering candle. The flame swayed gently, casting shadows along the walls, but it no longer revealed a face. It was just a candle now, or at least, that's what it wanted him to believe. His heartbeat was still erratic, his breaths shallow. The world he had fallen into, the woman, the voice, it had all felt too real to be a dream. And yet, here he was, sitting in the same apartment, the same wooden table, the same silent city outside. But he was not the same. James reached for the candle with hesitation. His fingers hovered just above the flame, feeling the heat radiating off it. Could he bring her back? Did he even want to? That voice. That face. You forgot me, but I never forgot you. His mind raced. How could he forget someone like that? Had they met before? Was she real? Or was she just some trick, a ghost from his past that he had buried too deep to remember? The candle crackled softly, snapping him out of his thoughts. He needed answers. But first, he needed air. James stepped out into the night, the cold air biting at his skin. He pulled his coat tighter around himself and started walking. The city never truly slept, but tonight, the streets felt emptier than usual. His footsteps echoed against the pavement as he walked aimlessly, his mind still tangled in the web of what had just happened. Every face he passed, every woman he glanced at, he searched for her. But she was nowhere. Had she ever been anywhere? James shook his head, frustrated. He needed to clear his thoughts, to push away the creeping paranoia. He stopped at a small cafe, one of those late-night diners where the coffee was always burnt and the waitresses always tired. The bell jingled as he stepped inside. A woman behind the counter looked up. Coffee? Yeah, he muttered, sliding into a booth. Black. The woman poured a cup without asking more questions. James wrapped his fingers around the warm mug, staring at the steam as it curled into the air. He needed to talk to someone. Someone who could make sense of this madness. And there was only one person who might believe him. An old friend. Let me get this straight, Ethan said, setting his beer down on the table. You bought a candle. You lit it. And instead of just getting some nice mood lighting, you saw a woman's face in the flames. James nodded, rubbing his temples. It wasn't just a face. She spoke to me, Ethan. And then I don't know what happened. I was somewhere else. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. Dude, you sound like you're losing it. James shot him a glare. I felt her, Ethan. I was there. I could hear her voice, feel the ground beneath my feet. Ethan studied him for a moment, his expression shifting from skepticism to concern. They had been friends since college, and James had never been one for wild stories or exaggerations. If he was saying this, he believed it. You think it was a ghost? Ethan asked. James hesitated. I don't know. Ethan took another sip of his beer. Maybe it's not a ghost. Maybe it's something else. You ever heard of soul connections? Past lives? James scoffed. I don't believe in that stuff. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You didn't believe in talking candle flames a few hours ago, either. James clenched his jaw. Fair point. Look, Ethan continued, leaning forward. If she's real, if this is real, you have to find out who she is. If she was part of your past, there has to be a record of her somewhere, right? James swallowed hard. The thought had crossed his mind, but he didn't know where to start. You got a name? Ethan asked. James shook his head. Then you light that candle again and get one. Back to the candle. James sat at his kitchen table once more, the candle flickering in front of him. His hands were steady now. No hesitation. He struck a match. The flame roared to life, bigger this time, twisting violently. The air in the room grew thick, pressing in around him. Then, she appeared. Her face was clearer now, her eyes piercing into his like she could see through him. The sadness in them was deeper, heavier, like an ocean he could drown in. Who are you? James whispered. The woman in the flame hesitated. Then, Isla. The name sent a jolt through him, like a distant memory trying to surface. Isla, he repeated. Do I know you? She nodded. But there was pain in her expression. Then why don't I remember? Her lips parted, but no sound came. The shadows around the candle flickered violently, and for a brief second, James saw something behind her, something dark. A shape moving in the shadows. Watching. Waiting. A sharp pain shot through his chest, and suddenly, the flame exploded, engulfing the room in blinding light. James gasped, stumbling back. And then everything went black. When James opened his eyes, he was somewhere else. No longer in his apartment. No longer in his own time. And standing in front of him, no longer in the flame, was Isla. But this time, she wasn't just a vision. She was real. And she was waiting for him. The world around James felt heavy. The air was thick, humming with an energy he couldn't explain. His breath came in slow, measured gasps as his eyes adjusted to the dim, golden glow surrounding him. He wasn't in his apartment anymore. The candle's flame had swallowed him whole, pulling him into something far beyond reality. And standing before him, no longer just a flickering vision in the fire, was Isla. Her presence was overwhelming. Her dark hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, her piercing eyes filled with an emotion James couldn't name. Fear. Longing. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, a flowing gown that shimmered under the soft light. Something about her felt out of place, out of time. James tried to steady himself, but the world beneath him felt unsteady, shifting like he was walking on something that wasn't quite solid. "Where am I?" His voice came out hoarse. Isla took a slow step toward him. "You're where you were always meant to be." James swallowed hard. "I don't understand." "You will." Her fingers ghosted over his wrist, light as air, but warm. Too warm. Like she was made of fire herself. Then, suddenly, images flooded his mind. Not memories. Visions. A grand ballroom, filled with candlelight. A towering mansion with high, gilded ceilings. He saw himself, but not as he was now. Dressed in a black suit, a velvet waistcoat, his hair styled differently. Standing beside Isla, his hand on hers. They weren't strangers. They had been lovers. James staggered back, clutching his head as the flashes came faster. Laughter. Dancing. Kisses stolen in dark hallways. And then, blood. A shadowy figure. A cold blade. Isla's scream. And then, nothing. The memories cut off like a snapped thread. James gasped for breath, his heart hammering as he stumbled. Isla's hands were suddenly on his arms, steadying him. "James," she whispered. "You have to remember." James blinked, his vision clearing. The golden glow softened, and suddenly, the world around him sharpened into focus. They were standing in a massive room, a ballroom, the same one from his visions. The floors were dark wood, polished to a mirror-like shine. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their crystals reflecting the candlelight like stars. It was beautiful. But wrong. The air was too still. The walls, though ornate, seemed almost haunted. Like this place hadn't seen life in a long, long time. "Where are we?" James asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. Isla turned toward the tall windows. Outside, there was nothing but darkness, a vast, endless void. "We are in a memory," she said. "A place built from what was left behind." James' throat tightened. This was real. She nodded. "It still is." James took a shaky breath, turning back to her. "You said I knew you." His voice was steadier now. "That we loved each other." "You did," Isla said softly. "And I loved you." James felt a pang of something deep in his chest, a longing that shouldn't have been there. "But something happened," he whispered. Isla lowered her gaze. "Yes." A deep sense of dread curled inside James. What was it? Her lips parted like she was about to speak. Then, the candles in the room flickered violently. A low whisper slid through the air, crawling over James' skin like cold fingers. It was a voice, but not one he could understand. It sounded old, twisted. James spun toward the sound. What was that? Isla grabbed his wrist. He's coming. James' blood ran cold. Who? Before Isla could answer, the room shuddered. The chandeliers above them swayed, the walls seemed to breathe. The whisper grew louder, forming into something almost human. You do not belong here. The voice was deep, ancient, filled with something dark. Then, the shadows in the farthest corner of the ballroom moved. James took an instinctive step back. The darkness in the corner of the room wasn't just a shadow. It was alive. Slowly, it took shape. A tall figure, its form shifting like smoke, its eyes two burning embers in the blackness. James' breath caught in his throat. The thing watched him. Isla's grip on his wrist tightened. We have to go, she whispered. James didn't argue. She turned sharply, pulling him toward the massive wooden doors at the far end of the ballroom. The air grew heavier as they moved, as if the very room was fighting to hold them there. Behind them, the shadow spoke again, its voice dripping with something almost like amusement. You cannot run from the past, James. James' heart stopped. It knew his name. He risked a glance over his shoulder, and immediately regretted it. The figure was closer. Too close. It wasn't walking. It wasn't moving. But somehow, it was there. James' pulse thundered. Go, go. Isla pushed open the heavy doors, and the moment they crossed the threshold, the darkness behind them collapsed inward, as if the ballroom had never existed. James barely had time to react before the world around them shifted again. The candlelight vanished. The floor beneath them vanished. And for a brief, horrifying moment, they were falling. James' feet hit solid ground. He stumbled forward, Isla catching his arm before he could fall. The world was different now. They stood on a cobblestone street, lined with gas lamps flickering under a starless sky. The air smelled of rain, of something old. James turned in a slow circle, his breath uneven. This was not his time. He knew that now. And as he turned back to Isla, he knew something else, too. This was where everything had begun. And if he didn't figure out the truth, it was where it would end. James stood in the middle of a silent street, his heart still racing from the fall. His feet rested on wet cobblestones, the air damp with the scent of rain. Gas lamps flickered in the darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. He turned to Isla, his pulse still unsteady. Where are we? She didn't answer right away. Her gaze swept over the street, the old brick buildings, the empty sidewalks. Her expression was distant, almost pained. Then she whispered, "Home." James' throat tightened. This This isn't possible. Isla looked at him then, her dark eyes filled with something ancient. You've been here before, James. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Because deep inside, he already knew that. The moment his feet touched these streets, something inside him stirred. A whisper of a life he couldn't quite grasp, memories just out of reach. The buildings, the lamps, even the way the rain pooled in the cracks of the cobblestone, he had seen it all before. But it wasn't just familiarity. It was nostalgia. A deep, aching sense of longing for something he had lost. James swallowed hard. What is this place? Isla exhaled slowly. A fragment of the past. A memory made real. James turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. It looked like an old American town, 1890s, maybe early 1900s. The buildings had tall windows, intricate brickwork, signs hanging over doors advertising bakeries, tailors, and apothecaries. It should have been alive. But it wasn't. There were no people. No sounds of footsteps or distant voices. Only the flicker of the gas lamps and the steady patter of rain. Where is everyone? James asked. Isla's lips pressed into a thin line. Gone. The way she said it sent a chill down his spine. James took a slow breath. And we're here because of the candle. Isla nodded. Because you lit it. Because you wanted the truth. James clenched his jaw. Then tell me. Isla hesitated, her eyes shifting to something behind him. James followed her gaze. And his breath caught. There, across the street, was a house. It stood at the end of the cobbled road, its white paint peeling, its tall windows dark. The iron gate in front of it was slightly ajar, swaying softly in the breeze. James' stomach twisted. He knew that house. Even though it made no sense. Even though he had never set foot in this town before. He knew it. His hands clenched into fists. That was my house, wasn't it? Isla's silence was all the answer he needed. James moved toward the house without another word. His boots splashed through shallow puddles, his breath unsteady. Isla stayed close, but she didn't try to stop him. The gate creaked as he pushed it open. A flash of déjà vu struck him so hard it nearly made him stumble. He had done this before. His hand on the iron. The weight of the gate. The smell of damp earth beneath his feet. His pulse pounded as he stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned under his weight, as if it, too, remembered him. James reached for the doorknob. And the door swung open on its own. His breath hitched. The house was waiting for him. Isla placed a hand on his shoulder. Be careful. James swallowed and stepped inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the candlelight returned. A warm glow filled the space, flickering over the wooden floors, the tall bookshelves, the elegant furniture covered in white sheets. The scent of old paper and lavender filled the air. It felt like a home frozen in time. James moved deeper inside, his fingers brushing over the dust-covered banister of a grand staircase. The deeper he went, the stronger the feeling became, like something was watching him. Then, a whisper. James' breath hitched. He turned sharply toward the sound, and saw himself. James froze. In front of the grand fireplace, flickering in the candle's glow, stood a version of himself. But not him. The man in the vision had his face, his height, his sharp eyes, but dressed in old-fashioned clothes. A crisp white shirt, dark suspenders, a pocket watch glinting in the dim light. And he wasn't alone. Isla stood beside him, her delicate hand resting on his. They were laughing, smiling. James took a slow, shaky step forward. The past version of Isla turned, resting her head against his chest. "You'll always find me," she whispered in the vision. "No matter how much time passes." James' chest tightened. His past self cupped Isla's face, his thumb brushing her cheek. "I swear it," he said. "Not even death can keep me from you." James staggered back. The vision blurred, twisting, distorting. The candlelight flickered violently. And then, the scene changed. The grand room darkened. The air turned heavy, charged with something dangerous. "And the past version of Isla," she gasped. A shadow fell over them. And James saw it. The figure from the ballroom. The dark presence, the thing that had whispered his name. It stood in the doorway, its form shifting like smoke, its eyes glowing like embers. Past James spun around. His eyes widened in horror. No. The shadow moved. Fast. A glint of silver. A blade. Then, Isla's scream. James jerked back to reality. His hands were shaking, his breathing ragged. The vision had vanished, but the house still felt heavy. James turned to Isla, the real Isla. His voice was barely a whisper. "I watched you die." Isla held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "You did," she murmured. "And yet, here I am." James felt the weight of her words settle into his bones. There was more. More than he understood. More than the candle had shown him. But one thing was clear. Something had torn them apart. And whatever it wasn't finished. If you've made it this far, you already know, this isn't just a love story. This is something deeper, darker. If you want the truth just as badly as James does, don't forget to like and subscribe. Because what's coming next? It's only going to get more intense. James turned toward the door, his jaw tightening. The shadow in the vision, the figure that had ended everything, was still out there. And he needed to know why. Isla reached for his hand. "We have to go deeper," she said. James looked at her, his heart hammering. "Then let's go." James and Isla stepped out of the house, the heavy door closing behind them with a final thud. The air was colder now, thick with fog that curled along the empty streets like ghostly fingers. James' hands were still unsteady. He had just seen himself, a past life, a love lost, a murder that had shattered everything. And now, the weight of that vision pressed on him like an iron chain. Isla walked beside him in silence. She hadn't tried to explain, hadn't told him what came next. Because she didn't need to. James could feel it. Something was waiting for them. Something that had been watching since the moment he lit that candle. They moved through the deserted town, the gas lamps flickering in the mist. Their steps echoed, swallowed by the eerie stillness. James glanced at Isla, her dark hair clinging to her face from the damp air. Then, a whisper. Not from Isla. Not from him. From the fog itself. James froze. His body tensed, his instincts screaming danger. Isla stopped beside him, her breath visible in the cold air. "You hear it too," she murmured. James nodded. His fists clenched. "Who's there?" Silence. Then, a figure stepped from the fog. Tall. Wrapped in a long dark coat, the edges brushing against the wet cobblestones. A hat rested low over his face, shadowing his features. James' stomach twisted. Because he recognized that coat. He had seen it before. In the ballroom. The man who had whispered his name. The man who had been watching since the very beginning. James' breath came slow, controlled. He wouldn't let fear rule him. Not now. The man took another step forward. The mist swirled around him like smoke, clinging to him as if he had risen straight from the depths of somewhere dark. James forced himself to speak. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head slightly, his face still obscured. "I've had many names." His voice was smooth, edged with something sharp. "But you, James, know me by one." James' heart pounded. The candle. The vision. The house. He was beginning to understand, this wasn't just about love. This was about something much bigger. Something older than him. Older than Isla. Older than time itself. James stepped forward. "Then say it," he demanded. The man let out a soft, amused breath. "You already know it." The fog curled tighter around them, the air heavy with something unseen. Isla's grip tightened around James' wrist, her nails pressing into his skin. James swallowed hard. He did know it. It was buried somewhere deep inside him, locked away like a secret he wasn't meant to remember. But the candle had started to unravel everything. And now, the truth was clawing its way back. The man in the fog took another step forward. The gas lamps flickered violently, the flames turning blue. "Say it, James," he murmured. "Say my name." And suddenly, James remembered. A name ripped through his mind, slicing through the fog of forgotten lives. A name that sent a chill through his blood. Lucian. James' breath hitched. The moment it left his lips, the entire street shifted. The buildings trembled. The lamps shattered. The fog twisted violently, forming shapes, faces. memories. And then, James was no longer standing on the street. Darkness swallowed him whole. For a moment, there was nothing. No ground beneath his feet. No air to breathe. Just an endless black void, stretching in every direction. Then, a single spark. A candle flickering in the distance. James staggered forward, the world shifting beneath him. His boots scraped against something solid, and suddenly, he was standing in a grand ballroom bathed in gold. Music swelled around him. Violins. A piano. The hum of distant laughter. James turned sharply, and his breath caught. The chandelier overhead glowed with candlelight. The polished floor gleamed. Couples danced in elegant gowns and tailored suits, their faces blurred, shifting like smoke. And across the room, Isla, standing at the edge of the dance floor, bathed in soft light. Her eyes met his, and for a split second, everything felt right. Like it was supposed to be. Like the universe had stitched them together in a thread of gold. Then, the music faltered. A single violin string snapped. A gasp rippled through the guests. The air shivered. James spun around. And there he was. Lucian. Standing in the doorway, his coat sweeping against the marble floor. His dark eyes locked onto James with something ancient. And in his hand, a silver blade, dripping with blood. James' chest tightened. His pulse thundered in his ears. Because this was it. The night it all ended. The night that had been haunting him since he first lit the candle. The night he had watched Isla die. James' entire body tensed. He wanted to move, to rush forward, to stop what he knew was coming. But he couldn't. This was a memory. A past that had already been written. A truth carved into time itself. He could only watch. Lucian strode forward, his presence commanding the room. The guests stepped back, their blurred faces filled with silent terror. The music had vanished. All that remained was the candlelight, flickering wildly. Lucian's gaze never left Isla. And for the first time, James saw it. The pain in his eyes. Not just rage. Not just jealousy. Something deeper. Lucian's voice cut through the silence. "You swore," he said. "You swore you'd be mine." James' stomach clenched. Isla's face was unreadable. That was another life, Lucian. Lucian took another step. And yet here we are. His grip on the knife tightened. You always find your way back to him. James' fists clenched. His past self, the one standing near Isla, was frozen. Helpless. Lucian's hand trembled. "Do you love him?" Isla's lips parted. "Yes." Lucian's face darkened. And then, the blade flashed. A scream. Blood splattered across the marble. And James' world shattered. A second chance at fate. James gasped. The vision ripped away, the ballroom collapsing into darkness. And when he opened his eyes, he was back in the fog-filled street. Lucian stood before him, his dark eyes burning. "You remember now," he murmured. James' hands shook. Because yes, he remembered everything. And he knew. The past wasn't finished with him yet. The fog clung to the streets like a living thing, thick and suffocating. James stood frozen, his breath slow and unsteady. The visions had shaken him to his core, the ballroom, the blood, Isla's final scream. And now, Lucian stood before him, the man who had haunted every lifetime, every past that had been stolen away. "You remember now," Lucian said, his voice calm. Too calm. James clenched his fists. His body ached from the weight of forgotten memories forcing their way back. "You killed her," he whispered. Lucian tilted his head, studying James with something unreadable in his dark eyes. "And yet, here she is. Alive. Standing beside you." James swallowed hard. Isla was beside him, silent, her fingers curled tightly around the sleeve of his coat. Her pulse was racing, he could feel it. She was afraid. But not of Lucian. Of what came next. James took a step forward. "You think that changes what you did? You took her from me." His voice was low, dangerous. "You killed her, and I watched it happen." Lucian sighed. "I gave you a gift, James." James' vision blurred with rage. "A gift?" Lucian's lips curled slightly. "I ended a love that was never meant to last." Something inside James snapped. His muscles coiled, ready to strike, but Isla's fingers tightened around his arm. "Don't," she whispered. Lucian's eyes flickered toward her, amusement dancing in their depths. "You remember too, don't you?" he murmured. Isla's jaw tightened, but she didn't answer. Lucian took a slow step closer, the mist shifting around him. "The candle doesn't just show you your true love," he said. "It shows you the truth." James' hands trembled. "The truth?" Lucian's smile widened. "Yes. And the truth, James, is that you and Isla were never meant to be." James' heart pounded. "You're lying." Lucian shook his head. "I never lie. The candle showed you love, but it didn't show you everything. Not yet." James' breath was shallow, controlled. He wanted to punch Lucian, to tear him apart for the things he had done. But something held him back. Doubt. A dark, slithering doubt curling at the edges of his mind. Lucian turned toward Isla. "You should tell him," he said softly. Isla stiffened beside James. "Tell me what?" James demanded, his voice sharp. Isla's lips parted, but no words came. Lucian let out a low chuckle. "You haven't told him, have you?" James felt his pulse thunder. "Told me what?" Isla finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You weren't the only one who died that night." James' breath hitched. The ground beneath him seemed to shift. What? Isla swallowed hard. That night, the night you saw in the vision, it didn't end the way you think it did. She turned to him, her blue eyes glassy with something deep and painful. I didn't just die, James. She hesitated, then forced out the words. I made a deal. James' stomach dropped. Lucian's smile didn't falter. Go on, Isla. Tell him the rest. She inhaled shakily, then finally said it. I made a deal, to bring you back. James felt the air leave his lungs. His mind reeled. His world tilted. You, what? His voice came out hoarse. Isla's gaze didn't waver. You were already dead when Lucian arrived. He didn't kill you. She paused. I did. The street was silent. The fog swirled around them, thick and suffocating, like the weight pressing against James' chest. You're lying, James said, but his voice wavered. He didn't want to believe it. He couldn't. But something deep inside him whispered that it was true. I would never. You didn't have a choice, Isla said, pain threading through her voice. James, you were dying. And the only way to save you was to, she sucked in a breath. To make a deal. A deal that bound us to this cycle. Every lifetime, every love, it's all been part of it. James' hands shook. A deal with who? Lucian let out a low laugh. With me, of course. James turned to him sharply. His pulse pounded. You. Lucian raised a brow. Do you truly believe I wanted to kill Isla that night? No. I wanted her for myself. But she chose you, again and again. And she was willing to do anything to keep you alive. James' vision blurred. His mind was a storm, memories crashing together, reality splintering. Isla's voice broke through the chaos. I thought it was worth it, she whispered. I thought we would have more time. But I didn't know the price. James swallowed hard. What price? Isla's expression darkened. The curse. Lucian's smirk widened. Ah, yes. The lovely little curse. Would you like to hear it, James? James' fists clenched. Say it. Lucian's voice was soft, like silk soaked in poison. You will always find each other, in every life, in every time. But in the moment you remember, in the moment you know the truth, one of you will always die. James' heart stopped. The weight of the words crushed him. Every lifetime. Every time he found Isla. It always ended in death. And now that he remembered, it was happening again. James' breath came fast, uneven. No. He shook his head. No, I won't let this happen again. Isla's hand trembled in his. We can't stop it, James. We never have. Lucian stepped forward, his gaze gleaming with something almost pitying. You can't fight fate, James. You never could. James' pulse roared in his ears. He wasn't accepting this. Not again. Then I'll change fate, he said through gritted teeth. I'll break the curse. Lucian chuckled, low and dark. You're welcome to try. But you should know, he leaned in slightly, voice like a whisper in the wind. No one ever has. James locked eyes with him. And for the first time in his many lifetimes, he wasn't afraid. Because this time, he was ready to fight back. The night air was thick, pressing against James like a living thing. His breath came slow and heavy, each inhale tasting of damp fog and the faint scent of burning wax. The candle. It still sat on the wooden table, its flame flickering softly, mocking him. He could still hear Lucian's words. No one ever has. No one had ever broken the curse. No one had ever escaped. But James wasn't just anyone. And this time, he wasn't going to lose. You're thinking of fighting fate, Lucian said, stepping forward. His voice held a hint of amusement, but beneath it, there was something else. Something sharper. Fear. You can't stop this, Lucian continued. You can try, but the moment you remember the past, the cycle begins again. One of you must die. James' jaw clenched. Then we do something different this time. Lucian sighed. Oh, James. I thought you would have learned by now. The curse doesn't bend. It doesn't break. No matter how much you love her, no matter how hard you try. James lunged. Lucian didn't flinch. With an effortless flick of his wrist, James was thrown backward. He crashed into the wall, breath exploding from his lungs. Did you really think brute force would work? Lucian mused. This is bigger than you. Bigger than her. This is fate, James. And fate doesn't care what you want. James groaned, forcing himself up. His body ached, but his mind was clearer than ever. He wasn't going to fight Lucian. He was going to fight the curse. Isla rushed to James' side, gripping his arm. Are you okay? James nodded, but his gaze stayed locked on the candle. Something about it felt different. James, Isla whispered. What are you thinking? He exhaled slowly. The candle showed us the truth. But what if it can do more than that? Isla frowned. What do you mean? James turned to Lucian. This curse started with the candle, didn't it? Lucian's smirk faltered. For the first time since the beginning, James saw something flash across his face. Worry. James' heart thundered. He was right. You've been using this candle to trap us in this cycle, James said. It doesn't just show true love. It binds it. It forces us to relive this over and over. Lucian stayed silent. Isla's eyes widened. James, do you think? James nodded. If the candle is the reason for the curse, he said, then maybe it's the key to breaking it. Lucian's jaw tightened. Don't be foolish. James ignored him. His gaze burned into the flickering flame. For centuries, this candle had shown them love. For centuries, it had led them to heartbreak. But what if? What if they could change it? James reached out, his fingers hovering over the candle's flame. James, Isla warned. Be careful. He took a slow breath, then he touched the fire. The moment his skin met the flame, everything changed. The world around them shattered. The room disappeared. The walls melted into darkness. The ground beneath them vanished. James was falling. And then he wasn't. He opened his eyes. And he was somewhere else. A massive hall stretched before him, lined with towering candles. Their flames burned in different colors: blue, silver, gold, crimson. James turned slowly, heart pounding. What is this place? Isla whispered beside him. James didn't know. But deep inside, he could feel it. This was the beginning. This was where it had all started. And this was where it could end. Lucian's voice echoed through the darkness. You shouldn't have done that, James. James turned to see Lucian standing a few feet away. But this Lucian, he looked different. Younger. Stronger. More dangerous. This place exists outside of time, Lucian said. It is the heart of the candle's power. And now that you're here, there's no turning back. James' fists clenched. Good. Because I'm not leaving until this curse is broken. Lucian exhaled sharply. You truly don't understand what you're asking. James stepped forward. Then explain it to me. Lucian studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. The candle doesn't just show love, he said. It chooses who is worthy of love. It binds souls together, but it also controls their fate. James' breath hitched. So it wasn't just a curse. Lucian nodded. It was a sentence. James' blood ran cold. A sentence for what? Isla whispered. Lucian's gaze flickered to her. And for the first time, his expression softened. You don't remember, do you? Isla swallowed hard. Remember what? Lucian let out a slow breath. The reason this all began. James' hands shook. Tell us. Lucian hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, You betrayed me. Silence. The words hung in the air. Heavy. Unshakable. James felt his pulse roar. Betrayed you, he repeated. Lucian nodded, his expression unreadable. Long ago. Before the curse. Before this cycle. He took a slow step forward. You and I were once friends, James. Brothers, even. And Isla. Lucian turned to her, something dark flickering in his gaze. You were my fiancé. James' breath stopped. No, Isla whispered. Lucian's jaw tightened. Yes. James staggered back. The air around him felt thin, suffocating. You're lying, he said. Lucian's expression darkened. Am I? James' mind raced. It couldn't be true. It didn't feel true. But deep inside, a part of him wondered. What if this whole time? What if he had been the villain? Isla was shaking. I would never. Lucian cut her off. But you did. And when I found out, I made a choice. His voice dropped lower. I cursed you both to suffer, to live and die in endless cycles, never able to truly be together. James' throat was dry. You. Lucian's eyes gleamed. And now, James, you finally understand. James' breath came fast. Unsteady. Because now, he did understand. The candle wasn't just a tool. It was a punishment. A punishment for a love that never should have been. And now, he had to make a choice. To break the curse. Or to pay the price. The truth is out. The curse, the betrayal, the love that defied fate. But can James undo the past? Or will history repeat itself once more? Like and subscribe to find out, because the next choice he makes will change everything. The silence was suffocating. James' mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. He and Lucian had been brothers once. Friends. And Isla had belonged to Lucian. It felt impossible, yet something deep within James trembled, as if his soul already knew the truth. Isla shook her head, her hands trembling. No. That can't be true. Lucian's expression was cold, unreadable. You don't remember, but that doesn't change what happened. James clenched his fists. And you cursed us for it. Lucian's eyes burned. I loved her. I trusted you. And you, his voice broke for the first time. You took her from me. James exhaled slowly. The weight of those words settled deep in his chest, heavy as stone. Isla's breath was unsteady. But if I loved you, Lucian, why would I betray you? Lucian looked at her, something raw flashing in his eyes. Because love is a fickle thing. And when you met him, I was no longer enough. James' pulse roared. The candle had bound them, forced them together for lifetimes. But now, standing here at the heart of its power, he could feel something else. A choice. For the first time in centuries, there was a way out. But the cost. James forced himself to speak. If we break the curse, what happens to us? Lucian's lips pressed into a thin line. You'll lose everything. The words chilled James to the bone. Everything? Isla whispered. Lucian nodded. Your past, your present, your love. If the curse ends, so does the bond that ties you together. James' breath hitched. He turned to Isla, searching her face. Could he give her up? After lifetimes of finding and losing her, after fighting to break free. Could he live in a world where she wasn't his? Isla's eyes were wide, desperate. James, what do we do? He didn't have an answer. And time was running out. The candle burned brighter, its golden flame stretching toward the ceiling like a living thing. Lucian watched them closely. Decide quickly. Once the choice is made, there's no turning back. James swallowed hard. His thoughts twisted in a storm of emotions. Lifetimes of pain. Lifetimes of love. Was it real? Or had the candle forced it upon them? Would they still love each other if the spell was broken? Or would they wake up as strangers? Isla reached for his hand, her fingers warm despite the cold uncertainty between them. I don't want to lose you. James closed his eyes. I don't want to lose you either. Lucian's voice was quiet. Then let the cycle continue. James' eyes snapped open. He turned to Lucian, his chest heaving. That's what you want, isn't it? For us to stay trapped, to suffer again and again. Lucian didn't deny it. If you stay, then you will always find her. No matter what happens, no matter how much you hurt, your love will always return. James' stomach twisted. But only because of the curse. Lucian nodded. Without it, you may never cross paths again. The thought was unbearable. He had spent lifetimes searching for Isla. Every time, he had found her. And every time, he had lost her. But was love meant to be forced? Was fate supposed to be a prison? James looked at Isla. If we end this, do you think we'll find each other again? Tears brimmed in her eyes. I don't know. James' heart ached. He wanted to believe. He had to believe. Because real love wasn't about chains. It wasn't about being bound by fate. It was about choice. And for the first time, they finally had one. James took a deep breath and turned to Lucian. I'm ending this. Lucian's expression didn't change, but James saw the flicker of sorrow in his eyes. Then you've sealed your fate, Lucian whispered. James stepped toward the candle. Its flame danced wildly, as if sensing what was about to happen. Isla's fingers tightened around his. Together? James nodded. And together, they blew out the flame. The moment the candle died, the world collapsed. A violent wind ripped through the hall, pulling at their clothes, their skin, their very souls. Lucian's voice echoed through the darkness. You have chosen oblivion. James gasped, reaching for Isla, but his hands were vanishing. Her face blurred, fading into the shadows. James. Isla. His voice fractured, lost to the roaring void. The weight of eternity lifted. The endless cycle shattered. And then, there was nothing. James' eyes flew open. He was lying on a park bench, the morning sun warm against his face. The scent of fresh coffee drifted in the air, mingling with the distant sound of city traffic. His heart pounded. Had it all been a dream? No. He could feel it. Something was missing. A weight, a presence that had been with him for lifetimes, gone. The curse was truly broken. But Isla. James sat up, his head spinning. He was in New York. The city was alive around him, normal, untouched by magic. His fingers trembled. Would he ever see her again? Was Lucian right? Had breaking the curse stolen her away forever? A breeze swept through the park, carrying the soft laughter of a woman passing by. James turned. His breath caught. A woman with long, dark hair walked past him, her face turned away. But something about her felt familiar. James' heart stopped. She hesitated, turned, and their eyes met. A slow smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Do I know you?" she asked. James' throat tightened. Maybe fate wasn't a prison. Maybe love wasn't a cycle. Maybe it was a choice. He smiled back. "I think we've met before." The city moved as if nothing had changed. New York streets were alive with the usual rhythm, horns blaring, coffee shops bustling, the air thick with the scent of fresh pastries and morning rain. But for James, everything had changed. He sat at a cafe near Central Park, fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee he barely tasted. His thoughts were a tangled mess, torn between relief and loss. The candle was gone. The curse was broken. He was free. Yet something inside him ached. Isla was out there. He knew it. He felt it. But she had no memory of him now. No memory of their lifetimes together. Would she ever remember? James exhaled slowly, staring into his coffee. Maybe it was better this way. Maybe fate had been forcing them together, and now, at last, they had the chance to find each other naturally. If it was meant to be, it would be. That's what people always said, right? But what if it wasn't? James closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. The world had given them a blank slate. But was she even looking for him? Or had their love been erased forever? The bell above the cafe door chimed, a soft, almost musical sound that cut through James' spiraling thoughts. He glanced up, not expecting anything. And then froze. There she was. Isla. Standing just inside the doorway, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. She was dressed casually, ripped jeans, a soft gray sweater, but she still looked exactly the same. James' pulse roared. She hadn't seen him yet. For a moment, he didn't move. Didn't even breathe. Was this it? The universe's way of handing him a second chance. Isla walked to the counter, ordered a coffee, then turned. And their eyes met. James' heart stopped. Something flickered across her face, recognition. Confusion. She blinked, tilting her head slightly. "Do I know you?" James swallowed hard. His grip on the coffee cup tightened. I'm not sure." She hesitated, studying him. "That's weird. You just feel familiar." James forced a small smile. "Maybe we met in another life. It was meant to be a joke, something light to break the tension." But Isla's breath caught, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. A strange look passed over her face. And then she laughed. Soft. Almost nervous. "That's a weird thing to say, isn't it?" she murmured. but for some reason, it doesn't feel wrong. James' heart pounded. Was it possible? Could some part of her still remember? Or was this just coincidence? She sat across from him before he could even think to invite her. And just like that, they were talking. It was easy. Too easy. She told him about her love for painting, about how she was trying to start over in New York, about the strange dreams she had sometimes, dreams of places she had never been, people she had never met. James listened, every word sending a chill down his spine. She didn't remember their past lives. She didn't remember him. But the echo of their love still lingered. I have this feeling sometimes, Isla admitted, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. Like, I lost something important, but I don't know what. Have you ever felt that? James hesitated. Yes. God, yes. Every single day since they had blown out the candle. But he couldn't tell her that. So he nodded instead. Yeah. I think everyone feels that way sometimes. Isla studied him, her brown eyes searching his. Do you believe in fate? She asked. James let out a slow breath. I don't know, he admitted. But I believe in choices. Isla smiled, small but genuine. I think I do too. Something inside James stirred. Maybe the candle had forced them together in the past. Maybe fate had controlled them. But now, this was real. She was choosing to sit here with him. To talk to him. To connect. And that meant more than 1,000 lifetimes of destiny. The conversation didn't stop when they left the cafe. The sun had started to set, casting the city in soft hues of orange and gold. Isla walked beside him, sipping her coffee, completely at ease. It felt natural. Like they had known each other forever. And in a way, they had. So, James, Isla said, glancing at him. Where are we walking? He chuckled. I have no idea. She laughed. Good. I like surprises. James' chest tightened. Had she always been like this? Light. Curious. Fearless. Or had he just forgotten? The past was blurry now. Their lifetimes together felt like a dream, distant, untouchable. And maybe that was a good thing. Maybe this time, they could love each other without the weight of fate. Maybe this time, they could be free. Some things are meant to be. Some things are built on fate. And some things are a choice. What do you think? Will James and Isla find love again, even without the curse? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that take you beyond the ordinary. The city had quieted as the night deepened. The streets, once alive with movement and voices, now hummed with a softer energy. The glow of streetlights cast long shadows, painting the sidewalks in a golden haze. James and Isla walked in comfortable silence. Their footsteps were slow, unhurried, as if neither of them wanted the night to end. James stole a glance at her. The way the city lights reflected in her brown eyes, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, it was all too familiar. Too real. Too much like before. But there was no magic now. No flickering flames showing her face. No whispers of the past pulling them together. This was different. And yet, she was here. With him. You never did tell me where we were going, Isla teased, breaking the silence. James smiled, shoving his hands into his pockets. I don't know. Just walking, I guess. She tilted her head, considering that. I like that. No plans. No expectations. Just seeing where the night takes us. James' chest tightened. She didn't know it, but she had just put into words everything he was feeling. For the first time, their story had no script. No fate pulling the strings. They were just two strangers on a midnight walk. A blank page waiting to be written. They ended up at the Brooklyn Bridge. The city stretched out before them, glowing in the darkness, the river below reflecting the shimmer of countless lights. Isla leaned against the railing, staring out at the skyline. I feel like I've been here before. James swallowed. She had. They had. 100 lifetimes ago. But he said nothing. Do you ever get that feeling? She continued, turning to him. Like you're reliving a moment, but you don't know why it feels so familiar. James' throat tightened. Yes. Every second with you. But again, he didn't say it. Instead, he nodded. Yeah. Sometimes. She smiled softly. I guess it's just one of those things we'll never understand, huh? James looked at her, his heart pounding. Maybe. Or maybe. Maybe some things never truly fade. They stood there for a long time. Talking. Laughing. Forgetting the rest of the world existed. And James realized something. This was better than all the love stories they had lived before. Because this time, it was real. It wasn't magic forcing them together. It wasn't fate playing games. She wasn't drawn to him because of a curse. She was choosing to be here. And maybe that was what love was supposed to be. Not something written in the stars. Not something dictated by destiny. But something two people built on their own. Isla sighed, stretching her arms. I should probably head home soon. James nodded, ignoring the sting of disappointment. Yeah, me too. She turned to face him, hesitating. Hey, this was really nice. He smiled. Yeah. It was. A pause. Then. Would you want to do this again sometime? James' heart roared. Not because fate had decided it. Not because the candle had shown her face in the flames. But because she had asked. She wanted to see him again. She wanted him. And this time, it was her choice. James stood at the foot of his apartment building, watching Isla disappear into the distance. She had turned back once, her brown eyes catching his, a small smile lingering on her lips before she rounded the corner and was gone. The city felt different. quieter, lighter. For so long, he had been chasing ghosts, memories that weren't his, echoes of a love he had only known through magic. But tonight had been real. No candle. No flickering flames revealing fate's design. Just him and Isla, two people standing at the edge of something undecided. James let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He had a choice to make. The apartment was dark when he stepped inside, the only light coming from the city beyond his window. And there it was, sitting on the table, untouched. The candle. The same candle that had haunted him, ruled him, bound him to a fate he never asked for. James hesitated before stepping closer. What if I light it? What if, just one more time, he let the flames show him Isla's face? Would it be different? Would it confirm what he already felt? His fingers hovered over the matchbox. Then, no. James exhaled sharply and stepped back. He didn't need it anymore. He didn't need magic to tell him what his heart already knew. The next morning, James woke up to sunlight spilling across his sheets. His phone buzzed. A text. Isla, morning. Did you sleep okay? He stared at the screen for a long time before typing back. James, yeah. You. A few seconds passed before her reply came. Isla, not really. Kept thinking about last night. His heart pounded. Then another message appeared. Isla, wanna get coffee? James grinned. Not magic. Not fate. Just her. Choosing him. Again. And that was enough. That evening, James returned home and did the only thing that made sense. He took the candle to the rooftop. The wind was cool against his skin, the city stretching out beneath him in endless lights and possibilities. For a moment, he just stood there, holding it. Then, without hesitation, he tossed it into the air. It shattered on the pavement below, wax and wick scattering like dust in the night. James smiled. Love wasn't about fate. It wasn't about flames whispering secrets. Love was about choosing someone, again and again, without ever needing to be told. And so, the candle's story ends. But James and Isla's? That's just beginning. What do you think happens next? Will they make it? Let us know in the comments. And if you love stories that linger in your mind long after the last word is spoken, don't forget to like and subscribe. Until next time.